hopefully June is going to be decent weather. You need a calm sea. Well, hopefully, middle of a British summer, it'll be calm. You need as much daylight as possible. We're going to land as early in the morning as possible to get the element of surprise. So June is the obvious month. And the last thing we need is the right tide. This is a problem between the Army and the Navy. The Navy want to go as far from the shore as possible, so they're not unloading men onto landing craft under heavy bombardment. The Army wants to get as high at the beach as possible, so they have less beach to run up while they're being shot at. But the problem with landing at high tide is you've gone over all the beach obstacles the Germans have waiting for us. If you land at high tide, you've got to wait 12 hours for the next tide to come in to pick your landing craft up to go back for reinforcements. So you go in on a rising tide, early in the morning, on a day with as much daylight as possible, on a decent summer's month, with a good moon the night before. And the day when everything was in alignment was Monday, the 5th of June. At a push, we could go on Tuesday, but after that, and unlike Brexit, there is a plan B. We wait a couple of weeks and we can go in on the 19th or the 20th. What does the D in D-Day stand for?
Departure.
Not departure, not decision.
Defeat.
Day. It's as simple as that. You don't want the enemy to know when your operation starts. So instead of writing the date in your orders, which the enemy could get a hold of, then you just say D. So everything after D-Day is D+, everything before is D-. So it doesn't matter if you go on the 1st of the month, or you have to delay it until the 15th of the month. Your objective on D+10 will be still 10 days after you start the operation. I got asked that question on the 70th anniversary. We had 16 coach loads of Americans in. And on the 15th, the lady said, "Richard, what does the D stand for?" So I explained it. She then called David over and said, "Could you tell David what the D stands for? Because he's never found out." So on the 70th anniversary, I explained D in D-Day to Professor David Eisenhower. A little bit of a surreal moment, though not the weirdest I had that. This, as I say, is not where D-Day was run from. This was the naval headquarters. This, in effect, is a show and tell. This is where the great and good came to be briefed on the Navy's plans. And for a good show and tell, you need a good visual aid. You can't get much better than the map. For years, we thought we knew who made it. A toy company in Birmingham called Chad Valley. But the weird thing is, in the bottom corner, it says IMA London SW19. Well, SW19 is around about the Wimbledon area. And my boss has always said, "I'll give a bottle of champagne to anybody who can tell us International Mapping Agency." Could be. On the 5th of June this year, we got an email. The map was actually made by the International Model Aircraft Company. This is a subsidiary of Lines Brothers. Lines Brothers, there were 3 of them, and 3 lines make a triangle. They owned Triang Toys, one of the most famous British toy makers. They owned Meccano, they owned Dinky. And in their factory in SW19 in Merton, their sawmill made wooden gliders, and in April 1944, a single line in their history said they made wooden plans of the D-Day beaches. So the Colonel is a bottle of champagne lighter than he was at the beginning of June. It was brought down from London on 2 Navy trucks. The reason that it took 2 trucks is this is only a tiny proportion of the original commission. What we asked for was a map of the whole of the British Isles, including Ireland, and the whole of the European seaboard, from North Norway all the way down the Atlantic coast to the Pyrenees and the Spanish border. Why did we ask for so much? This is the only bit we need, because careless talk costs lives. You work for Lyons Brothers, you're having a beer in the local. I don't know why the Navy wants a map of Normandy. They don't know if the man sat at the table next to them was a German agent. So it was brought down, it was offloaded at the front of the house. A carpenter from the Navy dockyard was brought up. He was told, burn that lot, we don't need it, but put the contents of these 2 crates up on the wall. And of course, as soon as he did, he knew exactly where we were going to land. So what did we do with the carpenter?
Shoot on him.
Every single group, we're British. We don't do things like that. I did have a rather mad little old lady about 18 months ago say, did you behead him? I think she might have been watching Wolf Hall. No. He was put under house arrest. He became the handyman for Southwark House. Any odd jobs that needed doing, he would do them. Don't feel too sorry for him. The King, the Queen, Churchill, the great and the good are coming here. So obviously his rations are going to be a darn sight better than they would have been back down in Portsmouth. What we don't know is who he was. And what we definitely don't know is, did he know he'd have to stay here? Or did he just wave goodbye to his wife one morning, just doing a job at Southwark, bacon and eggs for tea please tonight, because he set off in April and didn't get home until September 1944. That's how long we're still fleeing the Germans. So the map. The map is the original wooden map, designed to last 7-8 months. It's lasted 75 years. In England, or in Britain, we have a grading system for historic buildings. Grade 1 star is the best. Grade 1 is very, very good. Grade 2 is pretty good. This house is Grade 2 listed. 3 years ago, we got the map, a temporary structure, Grade 1 listed. So this gets rescued. The rest of the house can burn down, but the map definitely gets rescued. The silver areas on the map are minefields. If it's flat silver, it's British. So here we're protecting the Bristol Channel. In spring 44, we laid mines off Cherbourg and Le Havre, hopefully to bottle in the German surface fleet. If it's hashed silver, then it's a German minefield. The red lines are convoy routes. These have been swept clear of mines. Originally, they were in red tape, and at the case at the front, we've got some very, very, very faded pink tape. This was replaced at some point in the 1960s. And on the day of the landings, ships would actually join from Falmouth, from Plymouth, Dartmouth, the major ports, as the convoy worked its way along to the Isle of Wight. Off the Isle of Wight was Point Zulu, Piccadilly Circus. From Point Zulu, the convoy would then come down towards the minefield. Ahead of them, minesweepers had cut, dammed and buoyed channels through the minefield. For each of the beaches, there were 4 channels. Fast ships in, fast ships out, slow ships in, slow ships out. After D-Day, everything came from the east. If nothing else, Operation Neptune is a masterpiece of traffic control. 6,971 ships took part. On the journey over, we lost less than 10 to collision. That is just how good the planning for Neptune was. Quiz time. How many Normandy beaches were there? 5. Wrong.
7.
Wrong.
3.
Wrong.
7 here.
6. And the beaches were called?
Utah,
Utah, Omaha,
Juneau,
Sword, Juneau,
Gold.
Gold. Nearly right. This,
Had a gold one.
if you watch American documentaries or read American books about D-Day, is an American, British and Canadian operation. If you read British books, and watch British TV programs, it's a British, American and Canadian operation. And I'm sure the Canadians would put themselves first. Actually, it's the United Nations. We're fighting under the UN banner for the first time. The British actually had the biggest contingent, more British soldiers, sailors and airmen than any other component. But there were 17 different countries involved. The Free French, the Dutch, the Czechs, the Poles. There were even Australians involved in the landings. I gave a talk a couple of years ago to a group of Australians. Scary group. They were the Australian Army Women's Rugby Team. Now, if any of you who don't know what rugby is, imagine American football, but without all the namby-pamby armour that you wear. These girls smash into each other exactly the same as American footballers do, but without helmets and things. They were really quite frightening. But they didn't know there were 750 Aussies who took part. The Royal Australian Navy, the only naval bombardment on D-Day that actually hit the target it was aiming at. Everybody else's overshot for fear of hitting our own troops. The American beaches, Utah, Omaha. The rest, gold, jelly, sword, band. Goldfish, jellyfish, swordfish, and bandfish. The British and Americans are separated by a common language, as Oscar Wilde once said. What we call jelly, you would call jello. Churchill apparently said there is no way I'm asking soldiers to fight and possibly die on a beach called Jelly. So the J was retained, but Jelly became Juno. That was the Canadian beach. But Band Beach, that's the beach nobody's ever heard of. Well, Band Beach was absolutely vital. One of the key objectives of the airborne landings in the British and Canadian sector was the Merville gun battery. We hoped to secure the flank along the line of the Caen Canal and the Orme River, but east of that was Merville. A heavy German gun emplacement that would have wreaked havoc on the Allied naval forces. We need to neutralise it. We need to either capture it or destroy it. So the Paras went in. This is airdrop rather than air land. Jumping out of a plane with all its engines working. Never understood that myself. The problem with air land and airdrop is air land, either in a glider or today in a helicopter, everybody you need is in one place, but there are only a few of them. With airdrop, you get lots of people, but they get blown over a wide area. So when the troops hit the Merville gun battery, instead of a division, it was Otway and a company of about 120 men. They didn't have the demolition experts, they didn't have the signallers, but they took the battery. Had they have failed in that action, then the Merville gun battery would have still been a serious threat on D-Day, and the Royal Marines would have needed to land beyond the secured flank on Band Beach. So it was the beach that was never used. The genesis for D-Day goes right back to 1940. We've got our backs to the sea at Dunkirk. The Germans are advancing. We're trapped. We've got to get as many soldiers to safety as possible. We turn to a retired sailor. Admiral Bertram Ramsay had retired in 1938. He was a First World War veteran. But Churchill was First Sea Lord. He brought him back. He gave him Dover Command. The Americans, particularly before D-Day, viewed Ramsay as far too much of a micromanager. He was far too obsessed with details. Well, it's a damn good thing for the Allies he was. Everybody rightly talks about the little ships of Dunkirk. If it wasn't for Ramsay's capital ships, then Operation Dynamo would only have rescued the 40,000 troops that it was estimated to rescue. What Ramsay's tweaked plan did was rescue 338,000 troops. It enabled the British to carry on the war. This was Ramsay's battle headquarters in 1944. But as soon as we landed back on British soil, we wanted to get back onto French soil. And in 1942, an expedition set off from New Haven. The target was the port of Dieppe. The Dieppe raid was an Anglo-Canadian expedition, and it was an absolute disaster. Something like half of the 7,000 soldiers involved were killed, captured, or wounded. The Germans saw it as a huge propaganda coup. We knew that the lessons from Dieppe had to be learned for when we went back onto French soil for real. I've got a slight personal connection with the Dieppe raid. My ex-girlfriend's grandma. She had 7 Canadians billeted in her 3-bedroomed house in Eastbourne before the Dieppe raid. And a few months after the raid, Rachel's dad came along. So it wasn't just the Americans that left souvenirs behind in the UK during the Second World War. Looking at the map, where would be the best place to land in France from the UK?
Pas-de-Calais.
Why Pas-de-Calais?
Shortest distance between two.
Absolutely. It's as simple as that. It's the way in 1805 Napoleon would have invaded. But more importantly, in 1940, that is the route that Hitler would have taken. And of course, even if it's only in his own mind, Hitler considered himself a military genius. If that's the way that he would use, these inferior allies are bound to use the same route. So the door's already slightly open. All we need to do is just keep pushing and pushing and pushing that door ever so slightly wider. Yes, the Allies might land in Normandy, but look at that, it's 4 times the distance. Are the Allies going to have control of the sea and the air long enough to get the number of troops they needed across in a single day? Probably not. If the Allies do land in Normandy, it's a diversion, it's a secondary attack. The real attack will be in Pas-de-Calais. We relied on that assumption, and thankfully it was the right assumption. We need to know as much about the Germans and the defences they have waiting for us as possible. We have a wide variety of sources. We send over gun camera flights, 30 feet above the waves, a single pass and then back to the base in the UK. Thousands upon thousands of photographs were taken. We put out an appeal. Have you been to the continent for your holiday? Send us the film, send us the photographs. Tens of thousands of packages arrived containing film and photographs. They had to be sorted through, and everything other than Normandy was pushed to one side. But we still had an enormous amount to go through. 10 female reconnaissance experts were brought in from the States to help their RAF colleagues at RAF Meghanman. The tiniest detail could prove vital. Great photograph, somebody's granny sat on a deck chair on a beach. But the granny isn't the interesting thing, it's what's behind her. There was a concrete breakwater, and leaning up against that breakwater was what was described in the intelligence report as a courting couple, doing whatever it is courting couples do up against concrete walls. He is going to be 5'9", 5'10" tall. Using him as a scale, that wall was 6.5 feet high, which meant that the troops that hit that section of that beach needed 7-foot-long scaling ladders. Intelligence is vital. Every day, a 13-year-old French girl would walk along the beach behind the barbed wire. The German guards ignored her. She's just a kid walking along. She was pacing the distance between the gun batteries. The next day, between the command bunkers. The next day, between the anti-aircraft guns. All of this, via the resistance, was sent back to the UK, to our intelligence. We had a superb plan of the German defences. Below the watermark, Belgian gates and hedgehogs, steel structures that would rip the bottom out of landing craft, that would tip boats over as they came into the beaches. German telemines on posts. Amazingly, by the time we landed in spring 44, most of these had actually corroded. Most were worse than useless. Tank tracks on the beaches, mile upon mile of barbed wire. You then get the Atlantic Wall, a series of defensive fortifications from Norway all the way to the Spanish border. Thankfully, the Germans are logical. They build the strength deepest where the threat is greatest. So by May 1944, 80% of the defences around Calais are complete, while only 20% of the Atlantic Wall defences around Normandy have been completed. The Germans are helping to make our job easier. Then there are the mines. What's the purpose of an anti-personnel mine? What's it do to you? It wounds you. If it kills you, you're dead. One soldier out of the attack. If it blows your foot off, then you're lying there making a heck of a racket. 2, maybe 3 soldiers will stop and help you. So that's 3, maybe 4 soldiers out of the attack. So the Germans went overboard. Thankfully, they got nowhere near the total, but had they finished the Atlantic Wall, there would have been 205 million mines along the coast of Europe. Yeah. The fields behind possible landing beaches, a lot of them had been flooded. Some of them had wooden stakes driven into them. Imagine trying to land a plane, it would be smashed to pieces as soon as it landed. The best bit of flying in the Second World War, bar none, wasn't done by the Air Force. It was done by the British Army, the Glider Pilot Regiment. Just after 12:15 on the morning of the 6th of June, we captured Pegasus Bridge, the bridge over the Caen Canal and the Orne River. We got 3 gliders into a field the size of a football pitch. The holes had been dug in that pitch. The asparagus was due to be planted on the 7th of June 1944. Luck also plays a part in warfare. And what of the German troops themselves? They're a fairly mixed bunch. Most have been in France since the invasion in May 1940. They've been taking it a little bit easy. They're not battle-hardened anymore. Imagine, you are the Wehrmacht. I will give you a choice. Where would you like to be posted? Normandy, French wine, French cheese, French girls, or Russia? A fairly easy choice. Then there were the reinforcements. Northern French garrisons are being bolstered by recruits from other theatres of war. Except they're not getting 6'3" blonde, blue-eyed Aryans. They're getting pretty rank specimens, to be honest. They're getting the halt and the lame. Some of these were so ill that the native troops used to refer to them as the ear, nose and throat battalions. They were that unhealthy. Then there were the eastern troops. Latvians, Estonians, Ukrainians, soldiers from countries Hitler had conquered, soldiers who weren't keen to fight for the fatherland. But Rommel had read his history. At the Battle of Waterloo, the British had the Dutch and the Belgians as their allies, soldiers who 2 years earlier had been fighting for Napoleon rather than against him. They were always suspect, but Wellington put them next to crack British and Hanoverian troops, and Rommel and von Rundstedt did exactly the same with these eastern troops. There were some excellent German units, very, very good Wehrmacht Panzer units, SS Panzer units. The panzers of the SS were particularly nasty, but thankfully the Germans not only are a logical people, they're also methodical, and the SS Panzer unit actually worked in our favour on the morning of the D-Day landings for at least the first few hours. We know where we're going to attack. We know what the Germans have got waiting for us. Who is going to lead the forces? Well, the US Constitution states you will not serve under a foreign captain. It has to be an American in overall control. The man that was chosen wasn't a particularly famous fighting general. He'd held general officer rank for a relatively short period of time. He'd commanded divisions in North Africa and in Italy. We are now going to give him the biggest single Allied command of the war, and it was an absolutely inspired choice. He wasn't a great fighting general, but General Dwight David Eisenhower was a man who realised he wasn't an expert. And that's very, very good in a general, because he is a man who is not scared to ask for advice. You surround yourself with the best possible team. Ike said to General Marshall, the US Chief of Staff, if there are any problems and you hear about them from anybody other than me, then I have failed in my job. If there are any problems, I'm the one that the buck stops at. I then have to come to you. Who were his command? Well, for the naval contingent, it was obvious. He'd rescued the army from Dunkirk. He'd got the army onto the shores of Sicily with Operation Husky. So command of Operation Neptune, the naval component of D-Day, was Admiral, now after Dunkirk, Sir Bertram Ramsay. Who would lead the air component? Another Brit, Air Marshal Trafford Leigh-Mallory, one of the heroes of the Battle of Britain. He devised the big wing, getting as many aircraft up in a single place to help defeat the Luftwaffe in the Battle of Britain. But of course, boots on the ground are what win wars. Who will lead the troops on the ground? The Americans, and to a certain extent the Germans, thought they knew who it would be. They thought it had to be General Patton. Inspired cavalry commander, slightly unusual views, shall we say, about certain things. My favourite Patton quotation shows his view of warfare quite succinctly. He said, you don't win a war by dying for your country. You win a war by making the other poor dumb bastard die for his country. Well, that's how Patton viewed warfare. Unfortunately, Patton was in the doghouse. He'd struck a soldier suffering from battle fatigue. He was told by Eisenhower was told by a single US radio reporter, this is what Patton has done. Make him apologise, then sack him. Well, Patton apologised. Ike didn't sack him. But he did say, you will not lead the troops on the ground. Patton obviously was incredibly upset with that. He was then told, you will not be the senior US ground commander. He got a bit more upset. He went ballistic when he found out that one of his own subordinates, General Omar Bradley, would be the senior US ground commander. But even then, Bradley would not lead the ground forces. We knew that in the Normandy area, the Atlantic Wall was being bolstered under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. So who better to face Rommel on the battlefield than a man with a track record against him? Command of 21st Army Group was given to General Bernard Law Montgomery. This is where I start to enjoy myself. How can I put this delicately about an American historian? There is a certain American historian who will remain nameless, but I think you probably knew who I'm talking about. He really doesn't like the British. He really denigrates the British contribution to D-Day. He really, really dislikes Montgomery. He sees him as far too cautious. Well, Monty was the best man for the job. I won't quote a historian who, I can't exactly remember when he was born, but he can't have been too old in 1944. I actually quote General Walter Bedell Smith, Ike's Chief of Staff. He said, we couldn't have done it without Monty. If anything, Monty can be accused of winning too quickly. Montgomery was the product of his upbringing. He was also the product of his experience. Incredibly badly wounded in the First World War, the horrors he saw in the trenches meant he didn't throw his soldiers' lives away unnecessarily. Every plan was checked, double-checked, and triple-checked. You've got to remember, we have been fighting since September 1939. We have a finite number of soldiers. We're recycling the same troops over and over and over again. Churchill was told by Bevan, the Minister for Labour, if the war is not over by Christmas, in 1945 we'll be conscripting 16-year-olds. That's something that didn't even happen at the horrors of the First World War. Monty, superb strategist, excellent tactician, difficult man. He was a man who didn't hide his light under a bushel. I spoke 5 years ago to the scariest group I've ever spoken to. 30 American and 50 British. And they all had one thing in common. In June 1944, they were getting their feet wet on the beach of Normandy. At the end, none of them turned round and said, "You've got that wrong," which was very gratifying. But I told a story that I think illustrates something about Montgomery. He once visited a headquarters in London, and the first two people he saw were Churchill and King George, deep in conversation. He hadn't a clue what they were talking about, but he walked over, he listened in, he put his two penn'orth, and as he walked away, Churchill turned to the King and said, "I think he's after my job." The King replied, "Thank God for that. I thought he was after mine." At the end, one of the ladies at the back walked over and said, "Richard, my name's Arabella. I really enjoyed your talk. By the way, I'd never heard that story about my grandfather before. So I've met Montgomery's granddaughter and Eisenhower's grandson. It gets weirder." Actually, my favourite Eisenhower and Montgomery story illustrates the relationship between the two. Ike is obviously the supreme commander, but when he visits Montgomery's headquarters, Montgomery takes primacy. The first thing that Ike did, because that's the first thing Ike always did, is spark up a cigarette. Ike is on 4 packs of Camels a day. Montgomery absolutely detests cigarette smoke. In no uncertain terms, he turns around and he slaps the Supreme Commander down. Ike, brilliant diplomat that he is, quietly puts the cigarette out. But he said about 10 minutes later, King George walked in, and the first thing the King did is spark up a cigarette. Ike said, "I looked at the King, I looked at Montgomery, and when Montgomery didn't say a word, I quietly slipped another cigarette out and lit it." Actually, despite what some historians have said, despite movies like Patton, relationships between Eisenhower and Montgomery were still pretty good. Obviously, later on in the 1944 campaigns, things did deteriorate, but Montgomery, a professional soldier all his life, had seen things that Ike could never dream of seeing. He is seriously, in my humble opinion, one of our greatest military commanders in British history. So we have the command team in place. We know the date that we're going, we know where we're going. We now need to fool the Germans. We start off fairly simply. We drop 1 bomb on Normandy, we drop 2 bombs on Calais. We're not telling the Germans we're softening Calais up for an attack, we let them assume it for themselves. Every single radar station in Normandy is destroyed. We deliberately leave some working around the Pas de Calais. Up in Scotland, the British Fourth Army. The British Fourth Army is a fairly strong unit. The Germans know how strong it is because they keep on listening in to the radio traffic. Every now and again, everybody embarks on ships on the northeast coast of Scotland. They sail out into the North Sea for a day or so. It's an embarkation exercise. Where would they be going? Well, the Germans think the obvious place is Norway. The Germans are making heavy water in Norway, taking the start of nuclear weapons. So we need to bolster the defence in Norway. So the Germans move entire divisions from northern France and permanently station them up in Norway. There's only one problem with the British Fourth Army and their radio traffic. That's all it is, radio traffic. Radio trucks are driving around Scotland, sending messages, moving fictitious units around the Highlands. That works. We know that works because we know what the Germans are doing. We have got the Enigma machine. We've cracked the ultra code. Unfortunately, Hollywood is in California rather than Hampshire. Otherwise, you'd get the true story about how the Royal Navy went on board the submarine and stole the Enigma machine. But people like Alan Turing, he helped crack the code. At the end of the war, we actually gave Enigma machines to all our allies, including the Americans. We didn't actually tell you that we've cracked the code, so we were actually listening into all your secret traffic and actually knew what you were up to. But we did exactly the same thing with the Germans. They're spies. We know that the Germans are landing spies. What we don't know at the time, and we didn't know until 1945, when we captured the intelligence headquarters, is that we had picked up every single solitary German agent. An amazing feat. Some of these are really inept. My favourite is one who turns up in Kent, exactly where the Germans think the invasion's coming from. And what does he do? As soon as he lands, he walks into a pub. It's 9:30 in the morning, and he asks for a champagne cocktail. Sorry, sir, said the landlord, we're not open for another half an hour. Have a cup of tea. I'll just get my wife to put the champagne on ice for you. What she's actually doing is ringing the police and the Home Guard. And like every other German agent, we gave them a choice. You work for us, or we execute you. A number were executed. The vast majority were turned, and they gave very, very low-level intelligence under very strict conditions back to their German handlers. But there are a very special group of agents. These operate under the control of an office in Whitehall in London, the 20 Committee. Being a British government office, it has the number of the committee in Roman numerals. And the Roman numerals for 20 are XX. By a quirk of fate, they double cross, because these operate the double agents. There is the wonderful nymphomaniac daughter of a Peruvian guano magnate. She's quite special. She will come under the condition that her dog can come into the UK without going through British quarantine. And of course we lie through our teeth and say, of course you can. The dog comes in, goes straight into quarantine, unfortunately manages to escape, runs into the road and gets squashed by a truck. She actually had military intelligence over a barrel because she kept on threatening to give the code word to her German handlers that proved that she'd been compromised. Eventually, she admitted that she didn't, and she then was able to work for us. But the most famous of these double agents is a man called Juan Pujol Garcia. He's a Spanish onion farmer. He goes to British intelligence in Madrid, says, I want to spy for you, and we say, go away. A second refusal, so he goes to the Germans. Well, what can you offer us? Well, my company can fly me from Portugal, which is neutral, into Bristol. I can travel the country. I can tell you where the aircraft factories are, where the tanks are being made. I can recruit saboteurs. I can recruit sub-agents. I can tell you about the morale of the people. I can be really, really useful. The Germans jump at the chance. He's given a code name. He becomes Agent Arabelle. Arabelle has a couple of problems. One is he doesn't want to be paid in Deutschmarks. He wants dollars. Okay, that's fair enough. The other is that for somebody who's apparently operating in the UK, he can't understand English currency. His expenses claims are a long list of pounds, shillings, pence, tanners, threepenny bits, farthings, which the Germans then have to add up and then convert into dollars and then pay into his bank account. But he's a useful source of information. He tells the Germans about a convoy that's leaving the Bristol Channel. We have got the Enigma machine. We've cracked the ultra code. We pick up a message ordering a German submarine pack to intercept that convoy. There's obviously a German agent somewhere in the UK. There's also a bit of a problem because there isn't a convoy. But we'll cross that bridge later. Where is Agent Arabelle? He's actually in the Central Library in Lisbon. Brilliant things, libraries. Oh, Jane's Fighting Ships of the World. British Railway timetables. Encyclopedia Britannica. Oh, there's a British newspaper. Okay, might be 3 weeks out of date, but put the soccer results in and the Germans are bound to think you're somewhere in the UK. He is feeding the Germans absolute garbage. And the Germans are A, lapping it up, and B, paying for it. Anybody got any Scots ancestry? According to Arabelle, the dock workers of Glasgow will do anything for a litre of wine. Now, anybody who's been in a British pub more than 3 seconds, we don't drink litres, we don't drink wine, definitely not in 1944, and definitely Glasgow dockers do not drink wine. But the Germans are happy with quantity rather than quality. At this point, Agent Arabelle goes back to British military intelligence. I'm a German spy, but I want to work for you. We realise this is who we've been looking for. We bring him back to the UK. He gives the little truth followed by the big lie. He's such a good actor that gives him his British code name. To the Germans, he's Agent Arabelle, and to the British, he's Agent Garbo. Garbo is a master. He starts to recruit sub-agents. Somebody from the Admiralty, a few $100s. Somebody from the Air Ministry, a few $100 more. A Greek commercial traveller. A wonderful group, the International Brotherhood of Aryans. Apparently, these are 3 really disgruntled Welsh coal miners who hate the English. Well, I went to a Welsh university. I think I've met some of their relatives. In Lampeter, if you were English, you didn't go drinking in the ivy bush. Best of all, he has a wine waiter from Gibraltar. This chap is wonderful because he gets posted to virtually every military camp along the south coast, and in particular, the military camps around Kent. One of his sub-agents spots a new unit arriving. Another agent gives the cloth divisional sign for that unit. A third sub-agent gives a name and a strength to that unit. The Germans start to create an order of battle. Thanks to Agent Arabelle, they overestimate the Allied forces in Kent by 125,000 men. The Germans moved more troops from Normandy up to defend the Pas-de-Calais. By May 1944, Agent Arabelle has got 28 sub-agents working for him. The Germans have paid $340,000 into his bank account. It's a wonderful trick because none of these agents exist. They're all figments of the 20 committee. People like Dennis Wheatley, the horror writer, or a chap called Ian Fleming. He wrote a book you might have heard of, Chitty Chitty Bang Bang. They thought I was going to mention James Bond, didn't they? Arabelle and the other German double agents are absolutely superb in diverting German forces towards Normandy and towards Calais and away from Normandy. We have a couple of security breaches. An American major, he's got the plans for D-Day 1,150 pages long, on his desk, wrapped up in brown paper, tied up with string. He also has his girlfriend's birthday present on his desk, wrapped up in brown paper, tied up with string. I think some of you are ahead of me on this one. In a New York post office, a sorting clerk accidentally jogs a parcel. It falls off the shelf, hits the deck bursts open, and the 1,150 pages marked top secret fallout. He didn't take part in the landings. Down in Portsmouth, a British Army captain is having a beer. As he gets up to leave the pub, one of his friends shouts, "I'll see you next week, same time, same place." And across a crowded Portsmouth pub, he shouts, "Nah, this time next week I'll be in Normandy." He's just given away the biggest secret of the war. We can't forget the French. much as we'd like to on occasion. I actually had the director of the Peace Museum at Con here 5 years ago, and he wrote to me in April 2014 saying, could I borrow the map for my museum for the 70th commemorations? I just answered, to quote de Gaulle, no. De Gaulle's liaison officers, they were coming down to Portsmouth. They were put on board a train in London and told, don't speak, don't let anybody know you're French. They arrived at Portsmouth and a railway porter opens the door saying, bonjour to my brave French allies. And they said, how do you know we're French? And he said, well, that. And written in chalk on the side of the carriage was, reserved for the French Secret Service. Anybody like doing crosswords? The Daily Telegraph, British newspaper. Spring, early summer 1944. A couple of chaps in Whitehall are doing the crossword puzzle. One of the answers was 4 letters, U blank blank H. And the clue was one of the American ones. Silkworms eat them. The queen of the goddesses, the god of the sea, the god of the underworld, something. Utah, one of the American states. Utah is also a code name for the westernmost beach. The queen of the goddesses was Juno, the code name for the Canadian beach. Silkworms eat mulberries. We tried to attack Dieppe, it didn't work, so if we can't capture a port, we take 2 along prefabricated, the Mulberry Harbours. The god of the sea, Neptune, the code name for the naval part of the landings. The god of the underworld, Pluto, P-L-U-T-O, pipeline under the ocean. A fuel pipeline running gasoline from a fake ice cream parlour on the Isle of Wight down to supply the beaches. The clue that really gave them kittens, the answer had 8 letters and the clue was bigwig. And can any of you think of an 8-letter word meaning a bigwig?
Overlord.
So they rang the editor up. Your crossword compiler, decent egg is he? Very nice chap. 54-year-old physics teacher from Reigate, chap called Leonard Dawes. So they went for what the army calls an interview without coffee with Mr. Dawes. The first question is, why are you using code words in your crossword puzzle? He said, I'm not. A code word is a word that has a hidden meaning for you and somebody else. I'm just using words. They were stumped at that. After a long interrogation, they came to the conclusion that Mr. Dawes' crossword puzzle was just pure coincidence. Pure coincidence that 9 code words to do with the Normandy landings appeared over a few weeks in the spring 1944. Well, for 60 years it was put down as coincidence. Actually, not coincidental, but thankfully not malicious. Mr. Dawes had help. His schoolboys, sir, can you put such and such a word in your crossword puzzle? Sir, can you put Pluto in? Sir, can you put Mulberry in? The whole of the south of England was an army camp. Little boys hang around soldiers. They get given candy bars, they get given bars of chocolate. According to my mum, who was 15 at the time, they get asked questions like, do you have an older sister at home? They listen in, they overhear things. That is how 9 D-Day code words turned up in the Daily Telegraph crossword puzzle in 1944. Patton is brought back into the game. He's given a new command, the 1st US Army Group. Only one problem with FUSAG, like the British 4th Army, it's a phantom army. It's mooching around Kent, Norfolk and Suffolk and Essex, and everywhere that Patton goes, he's photographed, he's filmed. Some of these end up on the front page of newspapers. Those newspapers eventually find themselves into German hands. Well, there's Patton meeting troops, but what's that in the background? Well, Canterbury Cathedral. Well, if Patton is near Canterbury Cathedral, he's in Kent. And if he's near Kent, he's near Dover. And if he's near Dover, that is the way the landings are going to come. So the Germans move more units from Normandy up to bolster the defences in Calais. we're still bombing the French coastline. Over 9 weeks, we kill 11,500 French civilians in this bombing. We drop 190,000 tons of bombs. We lose thousands of Allied bomber crew. That's part of the real price of the liberation of Europe. But we've still got to train. We know the beaches in Normandy overlie large areas of peat. A 30-ton Sherman bogs down quickly. So we need to know where the peat is, and the only way to do that is to get boots on the beaches. And the problem with that is it's a German beach. But the British are inventive. We know the German character. They like a beer. So why don't we go on the one time we know the Germans will be getting plastered? Midnight on New Year's Eve. Brilliant plan, one problem. We're British. We don't believe in this continental funny time nonsense. We work on good old British summertime. 2-man teams were landed on each of the beaches. Their task, drill down with the augers, take the core samples, put them in the belts they had made and get back to the UK as quickly as possible. They went in at midnight British time. Unfortunately, it was 11 PM German time, and the Germans were still very, very, very sober. The most famous of these was Major Logan Scott Bowden and Sergeant Bruce Ogden Smith. Scott Bowden said, "I got hit by a searchlight. It felt like 5 minutes, it was probably a quarter of a second. Luckily, it moved on." They took the samples, they put them in the belts, they're swimming back to be picked up by a motor torpedo boat. Suddenly the major hears his sergeant yelling. He turns around and Bruce Ogden Smith shouting something and waving his arm wildly. Against the tide, he turns around, he swims back. "What is it, Sergeant?" And Bruce Ogden Smith said, "Happy New Year, sir." So he's got an absolute mouthful of obscene Anglo-Saxon from his major. But they went back twice more. Intelligence is vital. How do we get over the beach obstacles? Well, we turn to another one of the wonderful characters that Overlord throws up, Percy Hobart. Major General Percy Hobart, a tank genius, but whose views are considered far too left field. He's retired, he's serving in the Home Guard when the call comes through. This is what's waiting on the beaches. How do we get over them? Hobart comes up with a whole slew of vehicles. The Crab, a Sherman tank with 2 arms at the front. Between them is a revolving drum, and hanging from this a heavy metal ball and chain. As it spins round, it cuts through the barbed wire. The balls slam 9 inches into the ground. If it detonates a mine, then all you've lost is 1 ball and chain. 10 seconds to clip a new one on. 3 or 4 of these side by side going up the beach creates a highway for the advancing infantry to follow up. The Hedgehog, a Churchill tank that finds a spigot mine. The Crocodile, a Churchill with a flamethrower. We've got tanks that can bridge ditches, tanks that can swim. This was the lesson from Dieppe. The armour hits the beach with the infantry. We offered all of these, what became known as Hobart's funnies, to our allies. And the Americans said, all we need are the swimming Shermans. There have been many reasons given. Actually, the most logical is the simplest. Most of Hobart's funnies are based on British armour. You, as a US tank crew, don't want to have to carry 3 different sets of spanners because the British Army actually can't even decide on the same thread for our own nuts and bolts. We're working on 2 different measurements. That is one of the reasons why Omaha has become known as Bloody Omaha. Hobart was by far and away the best man for the job. It doesn't hurt, however, if you're John Montgomery's brother-in-law. That's not how he got the gig. We need to test the troops. At the end of April, we set up 2 live-fire nighttime exercises. We found a little village that's as close to the conditions on the beaches as we can find. It's south of Dartmouth and it's a place called Slapton. The British go in first. It's a nighttime live fire. The beaches have been cordoned off. Don't go beyond the white tape. Those are real bullets and real shells landing in that area. The British have exercise trousers. Trousers goes off without a hitch. It's now the Americans' turn. Exercise Tiger. Tiger was a disaster. We're on 2 different radio frequencies. The naval bombardment is half an hour out. And worst of all, as it's going in towards the beaches, a German torpedo boat has got in behind. The first torpedo slams into the landing craft. It flounders, it sinks. The second landing craft gets hit. 748 American soldiers drown off the coast of Devon that night. In the panic that follows, the troops go straight through the white tape on the beaches. 250 American soldiers die on a beach in Devon. More soldiers died on Exercise Tiger than were killed on on Utah Beach, the beach they were rehearsing for. Everything was hushed up. The figures were massaged into the D-Day figures. Some aspects of Tiger will remain locked in British archives for the next 25 years. There are still aspects that won't be released. We have to carry on. This is where the real D-Day hero comes in. His name was James Stagg. He was a rather miserable Scotsman, and his job, he was the chief weatherman. He's one of the few people that stays here all the time. As he walks out through that door, Ramsay's flag officer Creasy was overheard say, "There goes Stagg. 6'2" of Stagg, 6'1" of Groom." But Eisenhower said, "I just had to look at his face to see what the weather was like." For the whole of April 1944, he's actually been forecasting the weather. And every day he's got it spot on. May and April 1944 were a mini heat wave. It's now coming up to June. On June the 3rd, Eisenhower arrives here. He parks his caravan in Sawyer's Wood, just over a mile away. The first person he meets is Stagg. And the first thing that Stagg says is, "You're going to have to postpone. It's beautiful sunshine outside." Why postpone? Because of the storm. What storm? Well, the storm that's coming. He's getting weather information from Greenland, from Iceland, from Ireland. He's getting it from the Merchant Navy, from the Royal Navy. Everything is feeding back into this house, and he's coming up with forecasts. There's a high pressure area over France, a low pressure area over England, and the front where the bad weather is mixing up is right in the middle of the channel. Ike agrees to postpone. Only for 24 hours, but he agrees to postpone. That evening, the clouds gather. The drizzle starts, then the rain. Stagg allows himself a rare smile. He's got it right. Eisenhower has listened to him. The following day, the 4th, it's absolutely pouring down outside. Over in Normandy, the Germans see the same weather. They haven't got the same depth of meteorology that we have. This storm is in for at least a week, maybe 10 days. Luck plays a part in warfare. Rommel has gone back to Germany. The 6th of June was his wife Lucy's 50th birthday. He's got her a pair of grey suede shoes in Paris. He's gone back to visit the family. Ike gets the staff together. Stagg walks in and he has better news. There's an interlude, a blip in the weather. It should hit the middle of the channel on the 6th. It should last 36 hours. It won't be great, but it'll be better than it has been. It should be enough to get the troops across in a day. Ike turns to Montgomery. What should we do? Monty says, on the whole, I think we should go. 1-0 to leave. Ramsay, what do you think? I think we should stay. We should wait for the second window. If I have to turn my ships around halfway across the channel, it'll be 2, maybe 3 weeks before we can set off again. That's not the slot that we have. One more. Lee Mallory, what do you think? Lee Mallory says, I don't think we can fly in this. We can't precision bomb. We can't launch the airborne landings. I think we should wait for the second window. 2-1 to remain. Eisenhower doesn't cast a vote. He says, I'll sleep on it. He goes back to his caravan, smokes another couple of packets of candles, reads another couple of chapters of his cowboy novel, has another cuddle with his British driver. I said that to an American group once and got accused of outing the former president. So his driver was called Kay Summersby. She was definitely a woman. I was then told, you can't say that about one of our former presidents. They don't do that sort of thing. Jefferson, Kennedy, Clinton. I think we could probably mention the new bloke as well. The following morning, the 5th of June, the original date for D-Day. Just after 4 in the morning, everybody gathers in the house. Stagg gives a 2-minute forecast. He's much more confident. This interlude is on its way. Again, Ike turns to the command. Monty still wants to go. 1-0. Ramsey has changed his mind. He said, if you go, then give the order within the next 30 minutes. That's when my ships will have to set off in order to get to Piccadilly Circus on time, in order to get the Americans onto the beach at 6:30 and everybody else at 7:25. 2-0. It's up to Lee Mallory. Lee Mallory has been told expect 10 to 15% casualties of the airborne landings. 10% of 28,000 men is a lot of body bags. Eventually, he agrees. 3-0. At 19 minutes past 4 on the morning of the 5th of June, in the library, 2 rooms that way, Eisenhower says 3 words. Okay, let's go. He's the most important man in Western Europe. As soon as he says the word go, then an 18-year-old from Poughkeepsie in a landing craft with a rifle has more power to change what happens on the beach than the Supreme Commander. He has done the difficult thing. He's made the difficult decision. Everybody breathes a sigh of relief. Stagg comes back into the room. Ike puts his hand on his shoulders. If we've got this right, there's a case of whiskey in it for you. One of Stagg's Met Office colleagues puts his hand on his shoulder and said, if we've got this wrong, you know they're going to string us up from a lamppost. As he leaves the house at about 6 o'clock in the morning, the clouds have parted, the rain has stopped, and the sun has come out. Stagg allows himself the second smile of the last week. He's got it right again. We lose 4,800 soldiers on the morning of D-Day. That's a huge number. But is it? Think of what was achieved for that number of casualties. Think of the first day of the Battle of the Somme. The 1st of July 1916, the British Army alone took 58,000 casualties, 19,250 British soldiers killed. 1812, this is the big war in 1812, not the little local difficulty we had with you guys. The Battle of Borodino, Napoleon and the Russians slugging it out. It was the equivalent of a fully loaded 747 crashing and killing everybody on board every 5 minutes for 12 straight hours. Actually, 4,800 casualties seems actually light. We're still fooling the Germans. On the morning of the landings, Agent Arabelle has sent a message to the German handlers. His Gibraltarian wine waiter has spotted thousands of troops leaving Portsmouth, but they've only got 1 day's food and water. The Germans think it's an embarkation exercise. We send over a squadron of bombers. They're flying from Dover towards Calais, a long oval loop, each pass getting closer and closer to French soil, all the while dropping aluminium foil. This is why we didn't destroy all the radar stations around Calais. Suddenly, radar operators see what they think is a huge invasion armada exactly where they expect it. On the morning of the D-Day landings, we pick up messages moving German panzer troops from Normandy up to help defend Calais. It's a brilliant trick. Just after 6:30, Rommel is screaming down the phone. He's ordering the panzer troops, particularly the SS troops, to move forward, and the SS say no. Only one person can order us to move from prepared positions, and that is the Führer. And what's the Führer doing? He's fast asleep, having given express instructions under no circumstances ever wake me before 8:30. Are you going to be the corporal that knocks on his door? Even when he is woken, he said, this is a diversion. That is where the real landings will take place. Had we not listened to Stagg, had we waited for that second period, then the whole of world history could have been different. We would have sailed into the worst storm in the English Channel in 40 years. We would have lost the elements of surprise. We would have lost ships, aircraft, equipment. Most importantly, we would have lost men. It would have put everything back 6 months. Well, are we going to try in the middle of British winter? That puts it back another 6 months. In the intervening period, the Germans have developed the V2 ballistic missile. They're still developing heavy water, potentially nuclear weapons. But the real fighting is actually taking place in the east. We, by landing in Normandy, have given the Russians a breathing space. We're up against 78 divisions. The Russians are up against 220. By us landing in Normandy, it split some of the German forces. It allowed the Russians a breather. Why should we carry on the slog that we're taking at this rate? It slowed them down. Had we not landed, or had we tried to land and been beaten back by the sea, then that would have enabled the Russians to carry on the advance, because they wouldn't have stopped at Berlin, they wouldn't have stopped at the Dutch border, they wouldn't have stopped at the French border. Had we not listened to Stagg in this house 75 years ago last month, then it could have been the Russians we faced in Normandy rather than the Germans. I always tell our visitors there aren't many places you can visit where world history was made. This house is one of them. Hopefully before my throat gives up and you all fall asleep, because it's far too hot in here, if you've got any questions, hopefully I can try and answer them.